Alright, so welcome to our very first screencast for Chapter 18, and in Chapter 18 we are going to be discussing the nematodes. Now, a lot of people know the nematodes by their more common name called roundworms. And so in Chapter 14 we had talked about the flatworms, and so in this particular chapter we're going to talk about the roundworms. Now in this particular case you're going to find these worms as being both free-living, and you're also going to look at quite a few representative parasitic species in this particular group of animals. Now, before we can actually discuss the roundworms, we need to understand that we are now moving away from a group of animals that were considered acoelamates. Now, please remember back to Chapter 14 that the flatworms were considered acoelamates. Now, remember when we put the A in front of coelamate, that basically means without. And so in this case, we're talking about a group of animals that does not have a coelom. Now, a coelom is considered a body cavity. So flatworms do not have a body cavity. Now remember, they had a gut tube, but surrounding that gut tube they had a layer of tissue called parenchyma, and that parenchyma had a mesodermal origin. Now when you talk about nematodes, they are considered pseudosilamates. Now the word pseudo is going to refer to false. And so these are animals that actually have a false coelom or a false body cavity. Now over here on the right hand side, other animals like ourselves, for example, are considered coelamates or eucoelamates, and that basically means they have a true body cavity. Now when you look at the nematodes, since they have a false body cavity, they're a little bit different from the flatworms. They have a false body cavity because even though they do have a space that surrounds that gut tube, only the outside of that space actually has mesoderm, and that mesoderm actually helps to make up the muscles found in this worm. If you look around the gut tube, there is not any type of mesodermal layer. Now in the eucoelamates, this is where you do see that layer, and that's when you get more of a distinction of different types of body cavities found within these types of animals. Now if you are a pseudocoelamate, again you do have a body cavity. Even though it is considered false, it is considered a body cavity. It's going to surround the gut, as we had said before. Now this is going to provide a space for the development of various digestive, excretory, and reproductive systems. Now in addition to that, it's also going to be a lot simpler to distribute or move materials throughout the animal's body. It's going to provide an area for storage of waste products, and it's also going to act sort of like a hydrostatic skeleton or a fluid-based skeleton, and we're going to look at that in just a second. And it's also going to permit some internal circulation of various fluids within this animal's body. Now when you talk about nematodes, we're talking about a group of animals that is considered extremely diverse. And in fact, there's about 25,000 species that have been identified so far. But some scientists estimate there actually might be up to 500,000 species in the phylum Nematoda. Now they're going to be found in virtually all different types of habitats. So they can be found in the oceans, they can be found in the seas, they can be found in lakes and streams and ponds, and they can definitely be found in the soil. And in fact, 1 acre of topsoil can contain actually billions and billions of nematodes. Now nematodes can be free-living, but they can also definitely be considered parasitic. And they are parasites in both animals and plants. And over here on the right you can see this is a termite towards the top of the screen, and we have opened up the gut of this termite. And when we opened up the gut, all of these very tiny nematodes or parasitic nematodes fell out. Now over here towards the bottom you can see we have the inside of some animal. This would be the digestive tract of an animal, and you can see these nematodes that have attached themselves to the inside of the gut of this animal. So again, a lot of these nematodes can be free-living. There's also quite a few that can actually be parasites. Now again, when talking about nematodes, some of the free-living species of nematodes are going to feed on various things. And in fact, they're going to feed on bacteria, they're going to feed on yeasts, they can feed on fungal hyphae, which are simply the extensions of various different types of fungi, and they can also feed on different species of algae. So those ones that are more aquatic can actually feed on the algae found within that environment. Now, some of your more predatory nematodes, which mean those that actually go out and attack and eat other animals, are going to be those that could actually feed on rotifers, which is kind of very similar to a very tiny water flea. Tardigrades, which are more commonly known as the water bears. They could even feed off of some very tiny or small annelids, and annelids would be a group of animals that contains, for example, the earthworms, and they could actually even be predators to other types of nematodes in the environment. Now, they also serve as a very important food source for mites, insects, various larval stages of different insects, maybe mites as well, and also various fungi will work to decompose or break down nematodes in the environment. Now, in addition to serving as food, they can also cause some problems. They can cause some pretty extreme agricultural and domestic animal loss. Now, one of the most distinguishing characteristics with nematodes is that they have a cylindrical body shape, which means they have a body shape that is very similar to a tube or a straw. Now, they do express something called eutyly. Now, eutyly is where you have an animal that actually has a set number of cells. And these cells are going to be specifically somatic cells. And a somatic cell is a body cell. So usually we have two groups of cells. We have somatic cells, which are body cells, and we have our reproductive cells. Well, in nematodes, you have some species that will actually only have a certain number of cells. For example, if you have a species of nematode that, say for example, only has 64 cells, as that animal grows, the cells that make up that animal's body will continue to divide, but once they reach that magic number of 64, cell division will completely stop. And if that animal continues to get larger, the only way it can is if those cells actually grow in size. Now, most nematodes will lack cilia or flagella, except for one species. Most are less than 5 centimeters long, so they're pretty small in most cases, but there are some parasitic species that could reach over 1 meter in length. And unlike the flatworms, the nematodes do not have protonephridia, so they do not have a special organ like this that will be used to regulate the fluids within the animal's body. They're actually going to take care of this in a different way. Now, what's really interesting about nematodes is their outer body covering. That covering is called a cuticle, and that covering is super thick yet flexible, and it's considered non-living. So it's kind of like our fingernails in a way, and it's secreted by the underlying epidermis, also known as the hypodermis in this case. Now, so hypo, of course, is going to mean underneath, and so we have this epidermis that is going to fall underneath this cuticle. Now, this cuticle is going to be made of collagen, and it's going to be shed during various stages of juvenile growth. Now, over here on the right, you can see the hypodermis right down here towards the bottom, and it's going to be represented by this very thin sort of yellow layer in this cross section of a nematode, and the cuticle is going to be this thicker layer right on the outside. So as we said, the cuticle is going to fall right on top of that hypodermis. Now, there are going to be 4 hypodermal cords, which are going to contain nerve cords and excretory ducts. And so as you look on the cross section, you're going to see these 4 hypodermal cords represented here, 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 and here. And they sort of look like protrusions from that hypodermis. Now, if you notice, the one towards the top is going to contain the dorsal nerve cord, and this one towards the bottom would contain the ventral nerve cord. And these on each side are going to contain those excretory ducts that we had mentioned. Now, the cuticle itself is actually going to bear a great amount of that hydrostatic pressure that's going to be exerted from all the fluid that is found within the pseudocele. So remember, these animals have a false body cavity. So you see the gut tube right here, and you can see various reproductive organs that surround it. All of that is fluid filled. But remember, it's considered false because you don't have that mesodermal layer, that muscle layer that surrounds the gut tube. Now, in addition to bearing that hydrostatic pressure, the cuticle is also going to definitely protect the worm from various hostile environments. Now, these environments could be on the outside for those free-living worms, or it actually could be on the inside for those that are considered parasitic. Now, when you talk about the muscles found in the phylum Nematoda, compared to the flatworms, it's a little bit different. Remember when we talked about the flatworms, they had three different types of muscles. They had what we called circular muscles. They had the dorsoventral set of muscles, and they also had something called a longitudinal set of muscles. Now, when you talk about nematodes, they do not have circular muscles. They do not have a dorsal ventral set of muscles. They only have longitudinal muscles. And these muscles are going to be arranged in 4 different bands or quadrants within the animal. And you can see these quadrants on the right. This would be considered one quadrant of muscles, and you can see the muscles being represented by these cells right through here. So this would be the first quadrant. Here you can see the second quadrant of muscles. This would be the third quadrant, and this would be the fourth quadrant of muscles. And they're all going to be separated by the 4 hypodermal cords, which we had mentioned before. And you can see these cords represented right here, and of course right there. Now, where these muscles become really important is when we talk about the hydrostatic skeleton of these animals. Now, of course, these animals do not have bones like we do with our skeleton, but they have what we call a fluid type skeleton, which means they have a hydrostatic skeleton. Hydro refers to water, or it could just be some type of fluid found in the cavity. As we had said, these animals are considered pseudosilamates, so they have a pseudosil, so they have a fluid-filled cavity that surrounds that gut tube. And again, that fluid-filled cavity is going to contain various organs. And over here on the right, you can see various reproductive organs again found within this pseudosil. But what's going to happen is this particular fluid is going to work to transmit the force of the muscle contraction. So the muscles that you find in these 4 quadrants, when they contract, the fluid actually transmits that force to the other side of the animal. And what's going to happen is that's actually going to stretch out the cuticle on the opposite side of the animal. And so when that cuticle bends, that's going to produce the characteristic thrashing motion that you're going to see in a lot of nematode species. And in lab, you guys are going to get a chance to look at a type of nematode called a vinegar eel. And these are going to be live nematodes. And so you're going to be able to see that thrashing motion that's characteristic of a lot of nematodes. So that's going to finish up our very first screencast for Chapter 18. As always, please make sure that you have completed the study guide before you come to class.